Thank you so much for doing this. Would you mind just introducing yourself and how you were involved in the phone hacking scandal?
So my name is Nick Davies, and I was the special correspondent for The Guardian for years. And in that capacity, I spent something like 7 years investigating and exposing the phone hacking saga in Rupert Murdoch's company.
And I think what blew me away the most was how easy it is to actually hack a phone. And you describe it in your book, which I do have here. Would you mind just explaining how it works?
Yes, so when all this was going on, people were using voicemail messages a lot because this is before you have WhatsApp. And it turned out that it was terribly easy for third parties to intercept those messages, because when people started using their phones, they didn't change the factory setting on the PIN code, which meant that somebody could call their target's mobile phone number. And as long as that person didn't answer, they get the recorded lady's voice offering various options. They could push the button to listen to their messages, put in the PIN code, which was widely known because it was the factory setting, and then listen to every message that had been left. So it was a brilliantly cheap and effective and simple method of espionage.
And you wrote over 100 articles and spent a large portion of time on this story. What was your motivation to pursue it for so long when it was so hard to get the truth?
So the crime that's being committed in the voicemail hacking is really rather small. What makes the story important is that it links directly to the power of Rupert Murdoch. And the key component there was that very early on, it became clear that the Metropolitan Police had in their possession really detailed evidence about these crimes being committed by Murdoch's journalists, but had opted not to investigate because they didn't want to run up against Murdoch's power. And in the background, not so much directly related to the hacking saga, but widely in British public life, Murdoch's power has distorted the behavior of the British government for years. And so you could move from this rather small crime to the way in which Murdoch power was paralyzing the biggest police force in the country, and then to the way in which Murdoch power was distorting the behavior of the whole government. It's about power.
And Rupert Murdoch undoubtedly has a lot of power. And when you were exposing the scandal, did you ever fear what would happen if you published your findings because of the amount of power he had? Or did he actually ever retaliate to your work?
So when you're dealing with Rupert Murdoch, he's not going to hire gangsters to break your legs. He doesn't do physical damage, as far as I know. But he does present two kinds of threat. So the first is reputational damage, that his reporters will start digging into your private life. And if they can't find something there to embarrass you, they'll invent it. And that's an unpleasant prospect. And the second thing is that he is surrounded by extremely expensive and aggressive lawyers. And so there's that threat of legal action. In the event with the phone hacking saga, the legal action actually came from the police direction, who were using public money to threaten us with aggressive lawyers. The way that the Murdoch company responded primarily was with trying to damage my reputation, my editor's reputation, The Guardian's. And I mean, that the most direct example of that was reporters from The Sun digging into our private lives and looking for something embarrassing. But it did also involve them recruiting their political allies in the House of Commons to haul me and the editor in front of the Media Select Committee, with the intention, I'm absolutely sure, of ruining our story and also ruining our careers. I think if they'd got their way in that Select Committee hearing, both I and my editor would have had to resign.
So was their intention to just try and humiliate you and your editor in order to?
I think it's not humiliation for its own sake. It's humiliation in order to discredit us as sources and the story in order to reduce its impact. Because on the other side of it, they were frightened by the stories because we probably published, I don't know if you could quantify it, 1/20th of the scandal. And we didn't quite know what was there, apart from what we had discovered at that stage. But them sitting in Murdoch Towers, they know how bad the whole picture is. And so they were very alarmed. And so they tried very, very hard to damage our credibility. They made a stupid mistake, actually, because if they had just sat tight and not behaved with that kind of aggressive dishonesty, we'd have done a little bit of follow-up on the first story and then moved on to the next exciting adventure. But because they were attacking us and accusing us of misleading the British people and making things up, we couldn't move on. We had to stick with it, and therefore did uncover more and more. So it was their aggression got the better of them.
And what sort of culture do you think that Rupert Murdoch creates within his organisations?
Murdoch creates a culture of ruthlessness throughout his organisations. And that's because his demand for profit is absolutely overwhelming, and it's passed down through every level of the hierarchy, through his managers in New York, down to the managers in, for example, London, through to the editors, right down to the reporter who's going out to knock on somebody's door. You've got to do better. You've got to deliver more so that we can make more money in the center. I think Murdoch's interest in making money is irrational. It's pathological. I think that he's the victim of a personality disorder.
Do you think that it was, sorry, do you think that it was his pressure on the journalists that led them to actually do phone hacking and using other techniques, because they just were so overwhelmed by trying to succeed and impress him?
So I don't believe that Rupert Murdoch ever said, you journalists must deploy criminal methods to get me stories. But I do think that his relentless drive for profit created this hierarchy of ruthless pressure, which was passed on to those reporters, so that they were driven to do whatever it took to get the information that they needed to placate him.
And Rupert's decision to shut down News of the World was, as you say, ruthless. Mm-hmm. In your opinion, was it the correct one?
So the Murdoch decision to close down the News of the World was ruthless and selfish and wrong. There was something like 200 people working for the News of the World. Maybe a dozen of them were involved in the conspiracy to intercept voicemail messages. All of them were chucked out of their jobs. And Murdoch did that because simultaneously he was engaged in what would have been the biggest deal of his career, to take over all of Sky Television. And he was worried that the phone hacking scandal was obstructing that, as indeed it was. And he was dismissing those 200 people and ruining their careers, their lives, in order to be able to pull off that deal. So there was nothing right about it.
And do you think, so I've been doing a lot of research into this and trying to get my head around it, it was his organization, surely he knew it was happening, but do you think that people be naive to say that he didn't? Because his argument is that he was too far up the tree to know what was happening on the ground.
Yeah.
Is that true?
I would say that because Murdoch is in New York, right at the top of the tree, he wouldn't have known who was doing what in criminal terms on the ground. But I do think he knew that reporters sometimes use criminal methods, and that will have been true of his people. So in general terms, he knew it. You know that at a certain point in the phone hacking saga, when the masonry was collapsing on his company's head, he went in and had a meeting with his journalists, and some of the journalists secretly tape recorded what he was saying. And he said to them, I can't see why everybody's making such a big fuss about all this. Journalists have always bribed police officers. So there you have it in his own voice. He understood in principle that his people might well be committing criminal offenses, and he was relaxed about it. He wasn't saying, I'm shocked and horrified that this was going on. He accepted it as part of the way that his journalists were behaving. But I don't think it would be true to say that he knew the detail of what they were up to.
Do you think he just never acknowledged it so that he could have plausible deniability?
I think he's a pretty cynical man. I don't think he cared enough about the idea of his journalists committing crimes to even begin to think about whether he needed plausible deniability.
And how do you think that the phone hacking scandal affected people's trust in the journalism profession, or just generally the industry as a whole?
It's a very difficult question to answer. I think, you see, the awful thing is that the reputation of British tabloid newspapers is so bad that whether you're talking about the ordinary people who read the papers or people in the power elite whose lives are described and sometimes ruined in the newspapers, everybody knows that they're not a reliable source of information, and that some of the journalists who work there are really disgusting, horrible people. There was nothing new about that. So, I mean, clearly in the end, the hacking saga had an impact because we had a great deal of detail and a whole lot of factors came together. But actually, I don't know that people were that shocked. It was more like a confirmation of the worst things that everybody already believed about them and still believe about them.
Yeah, as a trainee journalist, I can say that people aren't too happy with us as a profession. And then just to kind of to clarify, you referred to Rupert Murdoch as being one of the top 10 worst people since 1945 because of the damage he did. Could you just expand on what sort of damage he has caused to our society?
Yeah. So Murdoch and his news organization over the years, first of all, have created cultures in different countries where people have become more stupid, less well-informed, more sexist, more racist, more xenophobic. And that's a terribly destructive thing to do in societies around the world. And then on specific points, he's done untold damage. His news organization has worked very hard at denial of climate change, which is the greatest threat faced by our species. And it's awful to consider the extent to which he has slowed down the reaction of governments to dealing with that threat. Also by pouring poisonous falsehood into the mainstream of public debate, his news organization is directly responsible for Donald Trump making it into the White House, and also to a slightly lesser extent, but nevertheless hugely responsible for the UK leaving the European Union. Both those two catastrophic political events floated into reality on a stream of falsehood, much of which was provided by Fox News, particularly in the States, and by the Murdoch tabloids in particular in the UK. That's a terrible record.
So do you think that he does affect does he change people's opinions, and does he affect their views on politics and other matters?
I mean, it's a very complicated thing to prove, but the simplest approach to this is politicians would not be so frightened of Rupert Murdoch. They wouldn't spend so much time trying to please him if they did not believe that public opinion can be swayed and moved by what his news organization says. And given that what they say will sometimes be cynical and false, it's very frightening for people in the power elite that there's almost no limit to what those news organizations can do, because if they can't find something true to say about you that will damage you, they can invent something to damage you instead. What
sort of morals do you think he passed down in terms of journalism to his son? Do you think that he gave him that ruthless sort of attitude to go through life, and that created a power hungry child, essentially?
Okay. No, so my understanding of Keith Murdoch is that he's a classic patriarchal figure, a bully and quite a ruthless man who was very busy acquiring power in Australia and using it for his own good. And as a role model, that's clearly quite destructive for his son. I also think it's legitimate to ask whether a father like that ever allowed his son, Rupert, to believe that he was good enough. It seems to me that it is possible that the young Rupert grew up feeling that he wasn't good enough to earn his father's approval, and that may be the source of this unstoppable need to acquire more and more money, as if to prove to his father that he really is good enough. And of course, he can never reach the point where he is satisfied that he is good enough, because Sir Keith is dead and can't tell him, whoa, enough, stop. So he goes on.
That answers the question perfectly. Thank you so much for your time today. You have got through everything that I needed. And I have to say, your book's been amazing, especially Flat Earth News has just massively helped me through an essay. So thank you so much.